Now, all of the rebel groups started looking for funds, and they started looking for weapons, and they were they were asking anybody they could for them. And the Americans overall, I think the most important thing that the Americans did was they had the CIA on the border with Turkey, making sure that they were vetting the weapons that were going in.
Even as there are supposedly these ongoing peace talks, even as the U.S. and Iran have at least stopped shooting at each other in the Gulf, the Americans have stopped bombing southern Iran, and the Iranians are not hitting targets in the Gulf anymore. The war is continuing and in some ways escalating. It's a really dangerous situation right now. I'm Borzu Deragahi. This is my podcast. It's called Badlands. You can subscribe at borzu.substack.com. You will excuse the unfamiliar settings. I am staying in New England on a visit to some friends out here, and so I'm just doing this kind of on the fly. I hope the sound quality is not horrible. I'll try to adjust some of the levels later. Later on in this episode, I have an interview, part one of my interview with Robin Yassin Kassab. He is a writer and activist and author of specializing in Syria, and he's got a book coming out about Syria and recent Syrian history, including the uprising against Bashar al-Assad, the armed insurrection that toppled him in 2024, and what has happened over the last couple years as this new regime has settled in, the one led by Ahmad al-Sharaa, who's often derided as a jihadi, as a head chopper. We discussed that in depth in part one of the interview, the history leading up to the uprising and the toppling of Bashar al-Assad in Syria and the installation of this new order. In the coming days or weeks, I will put up part two of my interview with Robin. It was a really good interview. I hope you tune in and listen. So basically, just in the last 24, 48 hours or so, there was, for the first time ever, an unprovoked Iranian attack, not directly provoked, on U.S. installations being used by U.S. forces in Jordan. Now, apparently all of the missiles were blocked. They were intercepted by the Americans. Perhaps the Iranians didn't really mean for this volley of missiles to hit their target. It was more of a warning. This came, as many have noted, right when Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is in Washington meeting with White House officials, including Donald Trump, hobnobbing with his partners in this war. He's unfortunately not joined by Lindsey Graham, or fortunately rather, because Lindsey Graham is dead, as we noted in an earlier episode of Badlands this week. So I think that this is basically a message to the Americans. It's like, hey, guess what? You might not be shooting at us, but we don't consider this a ceasefire. We know what you're up to. They see the planes, and they're refueling planes and other jets moving into the region from the Americans. They think that the Americans are just essentially refilling their stocks ahead of another round of conflict. There was also something else. The Saudis and the Americans joined forces to hit Iraqi militias, Shia militias in Iraq, often Iranian aligned. Now, these militias are complicated. There are militias that are part of the government. There are militias that are kind of against the government. There are militias that have a foot in each sort of world of being part of the official forces that protect the Iraqi government, are with the Iraqi government, and they have another foot in what is called the Islamic resistance of Iraq. That is a kind of network of more informally organized branches, shadow branches, rogue militias that sometimes are aligned with the government, sometimes not with the Iraqi government. And they're the ones who have been causing a lot of the problems in terms of the American forces and other forces in Iraq. They've been hitting U.S. bases. They've been apparently striking also at Iranian Kurd bases in northern Iraq. The base that was hit was in Diyala province. This is in central Iraq, an area I know quite well, part of the the river valleys and river estuaries of central Iraq, the Diyala River, and that area is a really volatile area, but the Shia militias have huge presence there. It is on the road between Iranian cities and shrine cities of Karbala and Najaf, the shrine cities on the pilgrimage route there, the historical pilgrimage route, and the Iraqi militias and Iraqi Shia have a huge presence there. And the fact that the Saudis are getting involved in this way suggests that they are getting also prepared for the next round in the fighting. No one is convinced that there is going to be peace anytime soon, that there's going to be a settlement, not with Benjamin Netanyahu in Washington, a meeting and planning with the rest of his informal war cabinet, and that is the American government at this point, despite the fact that the American voters don't want this. There was also something else that was kind of disturbing. These two natural gas carriers hit by drones in Egypt on the Red Sea port there, or near the Sinai Peninsula, perhaps near the Suez Canal. I'm not exactly sure of all the details, but that is also a disturbing development. I saw it confirmed in the news that this was a drone attack, and that was probably from the Houthis, probably from Yemeni Houthis. They're entering the war in a major way as well, and there is more and more activity happening with regard to the Houthis and their involvement in terms of blocking Saudi shipments from coming in through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Now, if they're going to block the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and then they're going to start attacking points further along on the Red Sea, energy points and energy infrastructure that is trying to get out of the Suez Canal, that is a really bad sign. They're saying, you know what, we have the ability to strangle shipping everywhere. So don't think that you're going to be able to alleviate gas and oil shortages by just having them exit the Red Sea and Saudi ports and other areas through the Suez Canal. We can damage that route as well. That is the message. So I think that there is really dangerous stuff happening in the region. I think it's probably the Iranians basically deciding that diplomacy is pointless with this particular U.S. administration, that every word that comes out of Donald Trump's mouth is a lie meant for market manipulation, that everything that the Americans done, they have reneged on. I saw the typical neocon dead enders. I don't know what else to call them, because someone who doesn't understand that they've been wrong for 30, 40 years and it just continues to bang their head against the wall. I just can't call them anything but like dead enders. They basically have no exit route. They're just in a dead end. They were saying that the Iranians threw away this amazing deal that was even better than the JCPOA that Donald Trump offered them. This is just propaganda, like literally propaganda. I saw some FDD people saying this, people at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies who were totally opposed to the MOU, now saying, hey, this was this great deal for the Iranians and they didn't take it. Well, the thing is that the Iranians gave this deal a little bit of a chance, but nothing came through. None of the unfrozen assets came through. None of the sanctions relief really came through. The Americans did not stop Israel from bombing Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Americans did not honor the language, as the Iranians interpreted, that gave them control over the Strait of Hormuz. Meanwhile, they're flooding the region with military hardware, and Donald Trump is on Truth Social 3-4 times, 5, 6, 7 times a week or more, threatening the Iranians with annihilation and warfare and more bombing and bombing like you've never seen before, etc. So he's violating the terms of that memorandum of understanding. And what some people were saying, some more credible and smart analysts with better track records, like Esfandiar Batmangelij, who has been a guest on this podcast before, what he was saying is that the Iranians have concluded that perhaps the Trump administration can't give anything that the Iranians want, that it's unable, that it is politically, logistically unable to do that. And he cited the example of how hard it's been just to get sanctions lifted on like Venezuela and Syria, even after the Americans installed a government in Venezuela that they like and were received by a government in Syria that is more amenable to the U.S. interests and Gulf interests and so on. Even after that, they've still had a hard time giving these two countries sanctions relief. So just imagine how difficult it's going to be politically in Washington for the Trump administration to come through on sanctions relief or unfreezing of assets and so on. So they're basically concluding, is the proposition that the Americans have not been able, even if they wanted to give Iranians anything they want, in which case they're going to be forced into a situation where they have to fight, because the Iranians are not going to reopen the Strait of Hormuz for nothing. That's the Iranian thinking. Why would they? Why would they reopen the Strait of Hormuz, allow more military hardware to come in, allow the U.S. to rebuild its oil stockpiles and give them time to access more missiles and weapons, move more hardware in there so that they can just attack Iran again in 6 months' time? And so the Iranian thinking is like, no, 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 we're going to and this is really scary, and people should prepare for this. The Iranian thinking might very well be, we're just going to tank the global economy. We're just going to totally, pardon my French, we're just going to totally fuck Trump. We're going to turn him into his worst nightmare. We're going to turn him into a combination of Jimmy Carter and Herbert Hoover, the presidents who botched Iran and were humiliated by Iran, and the president who oversaw the plunging of the U.S. economy into the Great Depression and destroyed the world economy as well, respectively. So I think that that is the thinking on part of the Iranians. So anyway, with that, this is the first part of my interview with Rabin Yassin Kassab. This is a guy who I've been following on social media, his writings, his articles for many years, and it was such a pleasure to have a chance to interview him. Have a watch or a listen. And now I'm joined by Rabin Yassin Kassab. He is an author, activist, journalist, intellectual, Syrian British, who has written a book. I'm not even sure if it's out yet, but we have a copy of it and I've been skimming through it. It's called The Blood Between Us. It's like the inside story of Syria and its revolution and the uprising that eventually led to the ouster of Bashar al-Assad's regime after many years of conflict and bloodshed. And, this is a story I think that's just far too misunderstood around the world. And I think it's so valuable to just re-examine this, because the way that the Syrian uprising and even the Syrian regime today is characterized, it's just so wrong-headed and jingoistic. I think there's not enough can be said about the real story behind what happened in Syria. And so with that, welcome, Rabin. How are you doing?
Thanks very much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Great, great. So I just wanted to say that I didn't get it. I skimmed through the book and really quickly, because you just sent it to me a couple days ago. And I looked at the first chapter. It's called 11 Days, in which it sort of summarizes the events leading up to the 11 days under which the group called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham launched a lightning offensive and took over the Syrian regime. Now, many people around the internet, around the world, they assume that this is impossible. How, they say, after a 13-year war, which appeared that the Syrian rebels and the Syrian uprising had basically had been defeated by the regime, how did these guys somehow manage to gather their troops and gather their forces and launch this offensive? And there's some startling revelations in that first chapter that we're going to get to, including some cyber warfare techniques that were, I think, very little reported or unreported until this book, and I think that they merit attention. But first of all, I just want you to give me, before we get into that, those sexy tidbits, just a little bit of the background. How did this, let's start with 2011 and its antecedents, and let's review really why it is that people were unhappy in Syria, and they came out during the spring of 2011 in these protests, because I think all too often right now, it's all depicted as a CIA operation. Oh, you mean the U.S., NATO, Israeli-backed operation to overthrow Bashar al-Assad because he was friendly with Iran, and this was all part of, one of another clean break, Western-backed neocon regime change operations. I think it's good to depict what was going on in Syria at that point.
Yeah, I mean, the 2011 uprising, which became a revolution, was part of the Arab Spring. So it was part of the larger movement across the Arab world, which mainly targeted, pro-West regimes like Mubarak in Egypt and Ben Ali in Tunisia and so on. But it was all but of course, the people in these countries didn't necessarily ask themselves, where does my regime fit on the geostrategic chessboard? They were more interested in the fact that economically our lives are terrible and getting worse. We don't have basic human rights. The police abuse us. We're terrified of the intelligence services. There's a huge amount of corruption in our regimes. So it was the same kind of spirit that launched the Syrian revolution. It was in the same months. It was early 2011. And at the same time that Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Bahrain were all bubbling. It came out of that movement. But then people thought, well, then it became a war. It became a war unfortunately, quite quickly in Syria. It didn't start like that, and people forget that it didn't start like that. At the beginning, you had millions of people from all sectarian backgrounds in all parts of the country, from all ethnic backgrounds as well, out in the streets, at first calling for reforms. And then, as the regime responded with extreme violence, rounding people up for torture, collective punishment, burning property, shooting at protesters, it got more and more, then people started actually demanding revolutionary change, the fall of the regime, a completely new start. And then it militarized. It militarized slowly but surely in the face of this overwhelming violence. And at first, this was just on a community level. It wasn't a centralized decision to militarize. In fact, many of the people who picked up guns knew as they were doing so that this is a political mistake.
Yeah.
This is not necessarily going to make things better for our revolution. It's not necessarily going to make the sectarian problem. It's not going to, it's going to create a lot of problems. And yet people felt usually that they had no choice, because they were facing such extreme violence that, people were coming into their neighborhoods, killing children, raping women, dragging young men out of the house and taking them away to never be seen again. So people started thinking, we have to do anything to defend ourselves. That's how it began, to defend our homes and our neighborhoods. So it started off with, a group of cousins or men who worked together would pool their money or sell some cars and buy some Kalashnikovs. And then you had hundreds of...
Just out of matter of curiosity, because, I spent a lot of quality time in Iraq. Guns are not as ubiquitous in Syria as they are in, for example, Iraq or Yemen, for example, where there is, as a gun is like in every room, like an ashtray, for example. There was a measure of gun control in Syria before the uprising.
There was. I mean, apart from the border areas have always been smuggling areas, and they've always had their own rules, and the smugglers there have had deals with the regime, and those areas have often had access to weapons.
And those areas where much of the conflict, where there was the most intense conflict too, interestingly.
Indeed. By 2011, after the wars in Iraq, there were even heavy weapons in Deir ez-Zor, in the east of Syria. There was a lot of same tribes and families on either side of the border, so this was a very porous border. And it was very easy to buy weapons, either from the regime itself, from the very corrupt regime, corrupt officers in the regime, or from smugglers in Lebanon and other places. So it militarized. And at first, this was thousands, literally, of different militias under the umbrella title of the Free Syrian Army, but not really under control. Yeah. And then as time went on and it got more and more violent and more states and foreign organizations got involved, more and more complex, different wars ended up being fought there. The Israelis against the Iranians, for example, fighting in Syria. The Turks against the PKK or the PYD, which became the SDF in Syria. So there were several wars going on at once.
Wars, etc. Yes.
The ISIS war of everybody against ISIS, and yeah.
You mentioned something that I think is key to perhaps the misunderstandings involved in assessing Syria right now and back then. You mentioned the weapons, and it's such an important point, where the weapons came from and so on. And at one point did the armed conflict start. Would you say that the armed conflict began before the international intervention?
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
I mean, the armed conflict was starting almost from the beginning, but it wasn't dominant until kind of halfway through 2012. But it was there from the beginning, because people were being shot and being killed right at the beginning. So people were taking individual decisions to try and get some weapons and fight back.
Yeah, and protect their communities as well, setting up
and protect their
checkpoints
communities.
with the
Yeah.
breakdown of order that was coming about. And just with regard to this conspiracy theory of this, what is it called? Operation Sycamore, the secret plot that everyone who lived in Turkey or was covering the Arab Spring uprisings knew about, and even the location of the command centers through which the CIA was sending weapons from Qatar